Some people believe destiny knocks only once, but I learned that sometimes it waits years before quietly walking back into your life, wearing a completely different face. My name is Dr. Ethan Walker, and for the last 9 years I believed I had already lived through the worst day I would ever experience. I was 32 years old when I lost the woman I loved and the child we had dreamed about welcoming into the world. Emily Carter was not only my fiancée, she was my best friend, the person who convinced me that life could be both meaningful and joyful even during the endless years of medical school and residency. We had already picked out paint colors for the nursery, argued playfully about baby names, and imagined family vacations that never had the chance to happen. Then one terrible afternoon, everything disappeared. I was told there had been an accident. I rushed to the hospital expecting to hold Emily's hand and promise her everything would be all right. Instead, I was met by grieving faces, quiet voices, and the heartbreaking words that no one ever truly recovers from. Emily was gone. Our unborn baby was gone. There had been no chance to say goodbye. There had been no final conversation. There had only been silence. For a long time, I blamed myself. I wondered whether leaving work an hour earlier or calling her one more time would somehow have changed fate. Eventually, I accepted that some questions never receive answers. I buried myself in medicine because healing strangers seemed easier than trying to heal my own broken heart. Year after year, I worked longer shifts, accepted more complicated cases, and became one of the youngest pediatric cardiac surgeons at St. Andrew Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. Parents often thanked me for saving their children, but every time I watched a mother hug her son or a father wipe tears from his daughter's face after successful surgery, a quiet ache reminded me of the family I believed I had lost forever. I never married. Friends tried introducing me to wonderful women, but I always found polite excuses. My life became predictable. Morning rounds, surgery, patient consultations, research, late dinners alone. Then, another sunrise would begin exactly the same way. 9 years passed so gradually that I almost stopped counting them. Until one rainy Thursday morning changed everything. I had just finished reviewing imaging results for a scheduled pediatric heart procedure when my colleague, Dr. Sarah Bennett, stepped into my office carrying a patient chart. "Ethan," she said, "the emergency transfer from Dayton just arrived. 9-year-old male. Congenital heart condition. The family specifically requested you after reading about your surgical outcomes." I accepted the chart without thinking much about it. Cases like this were common. Children arrived from across the Midwest every week hoping our hospital could offer treatment unavailable elsewhere. I studied the medical summary while walking toward the pediatric cardiac unit. The boy's first name was Lucas. His last name meant nothing to me. His medical history suggested he would need surgery quickly, but there was every reason to believe we could help him. I pushed open the examination room door expecting another frightened child meeting another unfamiliar surgeon. Instead, I stopped walking. A small boy sat quietly on the examination bed, holding a worn blue stuffed elephant against his chest. He looked up and smiled politely, the kind of brave smile children often offered adults when they were trying not to appear afraid. For reasons I could not explain, I felt my heartbeat stumble. It was not simply because of his age. It was something about his eyes. They carried the same gentle shade of green the first had once spent countless evenings looking into across dinner tables and movie theaters. His smile curved the same way. Even the way he tilted his head while studying my face awakened memories I had locked away years earlier. I introduced myself as calmly as I could. "Hello, Lucas. I am Dr. Ethan Walker, and I will be taking care of you." He extended his small hand with remarkable confidence before answering with words that made the room suddenly feel much smaller. "My mom always says good people find each other when the time is right, doctor." I had heard that sentence before, spoken years earlier by the only woman I had ever truly loved. After Lucas said those words, I stood there for a moment longer than any doctor should during a routine examination. I had spent years training myself to separate emotion from medicine. A surgeon cannot allow memories, fears, or personal feelings to interfere with a patient's care. Yet as I looked at this 9-year-old boy sitting on the examination table, I felt a connection I could not explain. I carefully reviewed his chart again, searching for a simple reason behind the feeling. His medical history was serious but manageable. He had a heart condition that required specialized surgery, and his previous doctors had done everything possible to keep him stable. Nothing in the paperwork explained why this child felt strangely familiar. I continued the examination professionally, asking Lucas about his hobbies, his school, and the things he enjoyed. He told me he liked drawing, building model airplanes, and watching old movies with his mother on weekends. Every answer was ordinary, yet every small detail seemed to pull at a memory I thought I had buried. "Your mom sounds like a wonderful person," I said while reviewing his latest test results. Lucas smiled. "She is. She always tells me that people who help others have special hearts." I looked down at the chart again. "Does your mother usually come with you to appointments?" I asked. He nodded. "She wanted to come today, but she had to handle something before driving here." I felt a strange sense of disappointment that I immediately pushed aside. I reminded myself that Lucas was my patient, not a connection to my past. A few minutes later, Dr. Sarah Bennett entered the room to discuss the surgical plan. She noticed my expression and waited until we stepped into the hallway before asking, "Are you all right? You seem distracted." I hesitated before answering. "There is something about this case that feels familiar." Sarah looked at me carefully. She knew my history better than most people at the hospital. She had been there during the years when I worked through the loss of Emily and the baby we never had the chance to meet. "Ethan, you know grief can make certain moments feel connected," she said. Gently. "Sometimes our minds search for pieces of the past when we experience something emotional." I nodded because I knew she was probably right. Still, something inside me refused to let go of the feeling. Later that afternoon, I met with Lucas and his mother over a video call to discuss the upcoming surgery. The moment the screen connected, I saw a woman sitting beside him. For several seconds, I could not speak. Her face appeared older than the last time I had seen it, but there was no mistaking those eyes. The same eyes I had once looked into while promising that we would build a life together. The woman on the screen was Emily Carter. My mind struggled to understand what I was seeing. 9 years of grief, unanswered questions, and memories suddenly collided in a single moment. Emily looked at me with the same shock I felt. Neither of us spoke. Lucas looked between us, confused by the silence. "Mom," he said softly. "Do you know Dr. Walker?" Emily's expression changed immediately. She looked away from the camera for a brief second before returning her gaze to me. "Ethan," she whispered. Hearing my name from her voice after 9 years felt impossible. I had imagined that moment many times in my dreams, but never believed it would happen in reality. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Where had she been? Why had I been told she was gone? Why had I spent nearly a decade believing I had lost both of them? But I was still sitting in my hospital office, still responsible for the care of a child who needed me to remain calm. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I focused on Lucas. I explained the procedure, answered his questions, and promised that our entire team would do everything possible to help him. But after the call ended, I remained in my chair staring at the blank screen. The child who had walked into my hospital needing a surgeon had unknowingly opened the door to the part of my life I thought was closed forever. And the woman I believed I had lost had just returned with a secret that could change everything I thought I knew. For the first time in 9 years, I left the hospital after sunset without thinking about my next surgery, my next patient, or the responsibilities waiting for me the following morning. My mind was trapped in a single moment that continued replaying itself over and over again. Emily Carter was alive. The woman I had mourned for nearly a decade had looked into my eyes through a computer screen. And beside her was a 9-year-old boy who carried pieces of a past I believed had disappeared forever. I arrived home, placed my keys on the kitchen counter, and sat in the same chair where I had spent countless evenings reviewing medical records. But that night, I was not looking at a patient's chart. I was searching through memories. I opened the old wooden box I had kept hidden in the back of my closet for years. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and small reminders of a life I thought I would never revisit. There was a picture of Emily and me standing outside the apartment where we had first lived together. There was another from the day we learned we were going to become parents. I held that photograph for several minutes, remembering the excitement in her voice and the way she smiled when she imagined our future. Then I remembered the day everything changed. I remembered the phone call. I remembered arriving at the hospital. I remembered being told there was nothing anyone could do. But now, after seeing Emily and Lucas, I had questions that had waited 9 years for answers. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Before seeing Lucas, I requested access to his complete medical records. I needed to understand every detail, not as a man searching for the past, but as a surgeon responsible for a child's future. The records showed that Lucas had been born in Ohio 9 years earlier. His emergency contacts listed only Emily Carter. There was no father listed in the available information. That detail stopped me. I knew it was possible for a child to grow up without a father's name on medical records, but combined with everything else, it created another unanswered question. I continued reviewing the file until I found his birth date. I stared at the screen longer than I expected. The timing matched the child Emily and I had once dreamed about. I immediately reminded myself not to make assumptions. Medicine requires evidence, not emotion. I needed facts. Later that morning, Emily arrived at the hospital alone. She looked nervous as she entered my office, and for a few seconds neither of us knew what to say. 9 years of silence stood between us. "Ethan," she finally whispered, "I know you have questions." I looked at her carefully. "I have spent 9 years believing you were gone." Her eyes filled with emotion. "I know. Then help me understand," I said quietly, "because I do not know what is real anymore." Emily sat down and took a deep breath. She explained that the accident had changed everything, but not in the way I had been told. She said there were complications after that day and decisions were made by people who believed they were protecting her. She told me that she had tried to reach me but was stopped from doing so. Every answer created another question. "Why did nobody tell me you were alive?" I asked. Emily looked down at her hands. "Because I was told you had moved on and did not want to be part of our lives." Those words felt heavier than I expected. I had spent years believing Emily had left this world, while she had spent years believing I had chosen to leave hers. Somewhere between those two beliefs was the truth. Before she left, I asked the question I had been afraid to say aloud. "Is Lucas my son?" Emily became silent. Her expression answered before her words did. "Ethan," she said softly, "there are things we need to talk about. But first, Lucas needs his surgery." I nodded because she was right. A child's health mattered more than our pain. After she left my office, I looked again at Lucas's medical chart. For years I believed my greatest loss was something I could never recover. But now, standing at the beginning of an impossible truth, I realized the past was not finished with me yet. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. The days leading up to Lucas's surgery became the most difficult of my career. Every morning, I walked into St. Andrew Medical Center reminding myself that I was first and foremost his surgeon. Personal questions would have to wait. Every decision inside the operating room had to be guided by science, experience, and complete focus. Yet every time I saw Lucas smile at me from his hospital bed, I found another small piece of Emily reflected in him. He laughed the same way she had. He tilted his head when he was curious. Even the way he thanked every nurse before they left the room reminded me of the woman I had once planned to marry. One afternoon, I visited Lucas to explain the upcoming procedure using simple language he could understand. I showed him a small plastic model of the heart and pointed to the area we needed to repair. He listened carefully before asking, "Doctor, will I still be able to play baseball after this?" I smiled. "That is exactly what I am hoping for." His eyes brightened. "Mom says you are the best surgeon in Ohio." Hearing Emily speak about me with respect after everything that had happened filled me with emotions I struggled to describe. Before leaving, Lucas reached into the pocket of his backpack and pulled out a small silver pendant hanging from a worn leather cord. "My mom says this has always protected us," he said proudly. The moment I saw it, my heart nearly stopped. 9 years earlier, I had given that exact pendant to Emily on the evening I asked her to marry me. It had belonged to my grandmother, who always believed family heirlooms carried stories from one generation to the next. I remembered fastening it around Emily's neck while promising that one day our child would know where it came from. Somehow that pendant had survived all the years that separated us. I gently asked Lucas where he had received it. "Mom gave it to me when I was little," he answered. "She said it belonged to someone who loved me before I was even born." After leaving his room, I found Emily sitting alone in the hospital chapel. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, filling the quiet room with soft colors. She looked exhausted, as though she had been carrying the weight of untold truths for far too long. I sat beside her without speaking for several moments. Finally, I looked at the pendant resting in my hand. "I remember giving this to you," I said softly. Emily nodded. tears gathering in her eyes. I never stopped wearing it until the day Lucas was born. Then I placed it around his neck because I wanted him to know that someone had loved him from the very beginning. I took a slow breath. Emily, I need the truth. Not guesses. Not pieces. The truth. She closed her eyes for a moment before answering. After the accident, I survived, but there were complications that required months of treatment. My father believed the stress of our relationship had contributed to everything that happened. While I was recovering, he controlled every decision. He told me you blamed me for losing the baby and never wanted to see me again. Later, when Lucas was born early but healthy enough to survive after receiving specialized care, he insisted that raising him away from you would be better for everyone. I argued with him more times than I can count, but I was recovering, frightened, and completely dependent on my family. I listened without interrupting. None of it erased the years we had lost, but it explained how two people who loved each other could be separated by lies instead of choice. Why did you not look for me later? I finally asked. Emily lowered her head. I tried. Every time I gathered the courage, I believed I had already waited too long. Then Lucas became sick, and my only thought was finding the best surgeon who could save him. I never imagined that surgeon would be you. The chapel fell silent again. We both understood that the greatest unanswered question still remained. I looked toward the doorway leading back to the pediatric ward where Lucas was waiting. The child who trusted me with his life deserved certainty, and for the first time I realized that after the surgery, there would be one final truth neither of us could avoid discovering. That evening I sat alone in my office long after the hospital corridors had grown quiet. The city lights outside my window reflected against the glass, while Lucas's medical file remained open on my desk. For years I had trusted evidence over emotion. Every diagnosis, every treatment plan, and every operation depended on facts. I realized my own life deserved the same standard. The next morning I met Emily in a private consultation room before Lucas's preoperative testing began. Neither of us wanted to continue living with uncertainty. If Lucas is my son, I said gently, he deserves to know the truth when the time is right. But first we need certainty ourselves. Emily nodded without hesitation. I agree. I should have done this years ago. She explained that during the confusion following her recovery, every decision had been controlled by relatives who insisted the past should remain buried. As the years passed, fear gradually replaced courage. She convinced herself that reopening old wounds would only hurt everyone involved. Then Lucas's heart condition became more serious, and finding the best pediatric cardiac surgeon became her only priority. Fate had brought us together again in a way neither of us could have imagined. After speaking with the hospital's ethics team and following every proper medical and legal procedure, we agreed to complete a DNA test using separate authorized samples. The laboratory assured us that results would be available within several days. Those days felt longer than the previous 9 years. During that time, I focused completely on preparing for Lucas's surgery. We reviewed imaging studies, discussed the procedure with anesthesiologists, and carefully planned every step of the operation. Lucas remained remarkably positive despite everything happening around him. Whenever I visited his room, he greeted me with the same brave smile. One afternoon, he proudly showed me a sketchbook filled with airplanes, baseball fields, and family drawings. I noticed one picture that caught my attention. It showed Lucas standing between his mother and a tall man wearing a white doctor's coat. Is that someone you know? I asked with a smile. Lucas shook his head. Not yet, he answered. Mom always says maybe someday I will meet someone who was supposed to be part of our story. His innocent words stayed with me long after I left the room. 2 days later, the laboratory contacted us. Emily and I met privately with the genetic counselor before opening the sealed report. My hands had remained steady through hundreds of delicate surgeries, yet I noticed them trembling slightly as I accepted the envelope. Emily reached for my hand without saying a word. It was the first time we had touched in nearly a decade. I slowly opened the report and read every line carefully. The conclusion was unmistakable. The probability of paternity exceeded every accepted scientific standard. Lucas was my son. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Emily quietly wiped away tears while I stared at the page that had changed my life forever. I had spent 9 years believing I had lost both my fiancée and my child. Instead, my son had been growing up only a few hours away, never knowing his father existed. I looked at Emily with sadness rather than anger. Too much time had already been stolen from all three of us. We cannot recover the years we missed, I said softly. But we can decide what we do with the years ahead. She nodded. First, we help Lucas get well, she replied. Everything else can wait. I folded the report and placed it back inside the envelope. At that moment, I was no longer carrying only the responsibility of a surgeon preparing for an important operation. I was carrying the responsibility of a father who had unexpectedly found his son. The operation scheduled for the following morning had always been important, but now it had become the most personal and meaningful day of my entire career because the child waiting in the pediatric ward was no longer only my patient. He was my family. The morning of Lucas's surgery began before sunrise. I arrived at St. Andrew Medical Center while the city was still quiet, carrying the same leather briefcase I had carried into hundreds of operations throughout my career. Everything about the hospital looked familiar, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every hallway reminded me that somewhere inside this building my 9-year-old son was waiting for me without fully understanding who I truly was. I stopped outside the operating room for a moment, closed my eyes, and reminded myself of the promise every surgeon makes before entering a procedure. Every patient deserves complete focus. Every decision must be guided by skill, discipline, and experience. Personal emotions could wait until the operation was over. Lucas deserved nothing less. When I entered his room, he was already awake, sitting comfortably in bed with his blue stuffed elephant resting beside him. He smiled as soon as he saw me. "Good morning, doctor," he said cheerfully. "Mom told me today is the day my heart gets fixed." I returned his smile. "That is exactly the plan." He looked at me thoughtfully for a moment before asking, "Are you ever scared before surgery?" Children have a remarkable way of asking questions adults rarely dare to ask. I pulled up a chair beside his bed. "I always respect surgery," I answered honestly. "That respect reminds me to prepare carefully and never stop paying attention. But I also believe in the team standing beside me, and I believe in you." Lucas nodded with surprising confidence. "Then I believe too." Emily stood quietly near the window, listening without interrupting. Our eyes met briefly. No words were necessary. Everything that mattered now depended on the next several hours. As the nurses prepared Lucas for the operating room, he reached into his blanket and removed the silver pendant that had once belonged to my grandmother. He held it carefully before handing it to Emily. "Can you keep this safe until I wake up?" he asked. She accepted it gently and placed it around her own neck. Watching that small family tradition continue across 3 generations filled me with quiet determination rather than sadness. A few minutes later, the transport team wheeled Lucas toward the operating suite. Before the doors closed, he waved at me and smiled once more. "See you soon, doctor." I answered with complete confidence. "Yes, Lucas. I will see you soon." Inside the operating room, everything moved with calm precision. The nurses completed their safety checklists. The anesthesiology team reviewed every step. Dr. Sarah Bennett stood beside me, offering the reassuring nod we had exchanged before countless complex procedures. She quietly said, "We are ready whenever you are." I looked around the room one final time. Every person present understood the importance of the operation, even though only Sarah knew how personal this case had become for me. Once the procedure began, the outside world disappeared. Hours passed measured only by careful decisions, steady communication, and complete concentration. Every movement had purpose. Every adjustment followed years of training and preparation. There was no room for distraction because Lucas deserved my absolute best, not only as his father, but as the surgeon entrusted with his care. Finally, the most delicate portion of the repair was complete. The monitors reflected the steady rhythm we had hoped to achieve. Around me, I noticed small expressions of relief spreading across the faces of the surgical team, but no one celebrated early. We continued methodically through every remaining step until the operation reached its conclusion. After we completed the final checks, I slowly removed my gloves and stepped back. Sarah looked toward me with a quiet smile. "Beautiful work, Ethan," she said softly. I thanked every member of the team before leaving the operating room. Outside, Emily stood exactly where I had last seen her, holding the silver pendant tightly in both hands. The moment she saw me, she searched my face for an answer before I spoke a single word. I smiled for the first time that day. "The surgery went exactly as we hoped," I said. Tears filled her eyes as relief replaced weeks of fear. We stood there together in the silent hospital corridor, knowing that one life had just been given a healthier future. But as Lucas began his recovery, another conversation still waited for us, because saving his heart had been only the first step toward healing the family that had unknowingly been separated for 9 long years. The days following Lucas's surgery were filled with moments I never thought I would experience. I had spent 9 years believing that the most painful chapter of my life was already finished, but I soon realized that finding my son was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of learning how to become part of his life. Lucas recovered faster than expected. Each morning when I visited his hospital room, he greeted me with the same curiosity and optimism he had shown from the very beginning. He asked about my childhood, my favorite foods, and what it was like to become a doctor. I answered every question because for 9 years I had imagined all the conversations we would never have. Now I was finally having them. One afternoon, Lucas looked at me while drawing in his sketchbook and asked, "Doctor, do you have any children?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything we had recently discovered. I looked at Emily, who was sitting nearby. She gave me a quiet nod, allowing me to answer honestly. I took a slow breath. "Yes, Lucas, I do." He looked surprised. "Really? Where are they?" I smiled gently. "Right here." For a few seconds he did not understand. Then he looked at Emily, then back at me. His expression changed as he began connecting the pieces adults had carefully explained to him. "You mean?" he whispered. Emily moved closer and sat beside him. "Lucas, there are many things we need to talk about, but there is one thing you should always know. You were loved before you were born. You have always been loved." Lucas looked between us quietly. He did not react with anger or confusion. Instead, he asked the question that revealed the wisdom children often have. Why did nobody tell me? That question stayed in my heart because it was the same question I had carried for 9 years. Emily gently explained that many adults had made decisions out of fear and believed they were protecting people. She admitted that some choices had caused pain instead. She did not make excuses. She simply told him the truth in a way a child could understand. I watched my son listen carefully, and I realized that honesty did not erase the past, but it gave everyone a chance to build something better. Later that evening, after Lucas fell asleep, Emily and I sat in the hospital cafeteria with 2 cups of coffee between us. For the first time since she returned, we talked without the weight of unanswered questions. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I should have fought harder to find you." I looked down at my coffee cup before answering. "I spent years believing you were gone. I was angry at the world, but I was never angry at you." She wiped away a tear and nodded. "I know we cannot get those years back." "No," I replied, "but we can decide what happens next." We talked about the future carefully. There were no promises made too quickly. 9 years of separation could not disappear overnight. We both understood that rebuilding trust would require patience. But for the first time, we were no longer 2 people separated by misunderstandings. We were 2 parents trying to give our son the family connection he deserved. A week later, Lucas was discharged from the hospital. Before leaving, he asked if I would come to his school art show the following month. It was a small invitation, but to me it meant everything. I smiled and told him I would be there. That evening, I returned home and looked through the old photographs I had kept hidden away for years. The pictures still showed the same memories, but they no longer represented only loss. They represented a chapter that had been interrupted and might finally continue. I understood something important then. Sometimes life does not return what was taken away in the same form. Sometimes it brings something new, something unexpected, and asks whether you are brave enough to accept it. 9 years earlier, I thought my family had ended forever. Now I was learning that some stories do not end when the page is turned. They simply wait for the moment when someone is ready to begin writing again. The first time I walked into Lucas's school after discovering he was my son, I felt a nervousness I had not experienced in any operating room. I had spent years making decisions under pressure, surrounded by advanced technology, medical teams, and families trusting me with their children's lives. Yet standing in the hallway of an elementary school with a small invitation card in my hand felt completely different. This was not about being a surgeon. This was about being a father. Lucas had invited me to his art show, and I arrived early because I did not want to miss a single moment. The walls were covered with colorful drawings created by children from his class. Parents walked around proudly pointing at their children's artwork and taking photographs. For many families, it was an ordinary school event. For me, it was a moment I had never believed I would experience. Then I saw Lucas standing beside one of his drawings. He noticed me immediately and smiled. "You came," he said excitedly. I smiled back. "Of course I came." He looked proud as he explained every detail of his artwork. It was a drawing of a family standing beside a house with a bright sun above them. There were 3 people in the picture: a mother, a child, and a father. I looked at the drawing carefully, but did not ask questions. Some moments are too meaningful to interrupt. Over the following months, Lucas and I slowly built a relationship based on small moments rather than promises. I attended his baseball games. I helped him with science projects. We visited the museum and spent hours discussing airplanes because he wanted to know how everything worked. I learned that being a father was not about making up for lost time in a single day. It was about showing up consistently and creating new memories. Emily and I also continued rebuilding our relationship carefully. We were no longer the young couple who believed life would always follow the plans we created. Too much had happened for us to pretend nothing changed. But we had something more valuable than the dreams we lost. We had honesty. One evening, Emily and I sat on the porch of her home while Lucas played in the backyard. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold, and for the first time in years, the silence between us felt peaceful. "I used to wonder what our life would have looked like," Emily said quietly. I looked toward the backyard where Lucas was laughing. I wondered the same thing. She smiled sadly. "Do you ever think about the years we missed?" I nodded. "Every day, but I also think about the years we still have." We both understood that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to let the past control every moment of the future. A few weeks later, we finally confronted the person whose decisions had separated us. Emily's father, Michael Carter, agreed to meet after years of avoiding the truth. The conversation was difficult, but it was necessary. He admitted that after the accident, he believed he was protecting Emily and Lucas by controlling the situation. He had convinced himself that keeping everyone apart was the safest choice. Listening to him, I realized something important. People can sometimes make harmful decisions while believing they are doing the right thing. Understanding the reason does not erase the consequences, but it helps explain how a painful situation began. Emily told her father that love should never be built on secrets or control. Lucas deserved to grow up knowing the truth about his family. After that conversation, our family did not become perfect overnight. Real life does not work that way. But something changed. The hidden pain that had followed us for 9 years finally had a place to go. It was no longer carried silently by one person. It became something we could face together. Months later, I stood in my kitchen watching Lucas prepare breakfast while Emily laughed at his creative attempt to make pancakes. The scene was simple. It was ordinary. Yet I knew I would remember it forever. For years I believed my greatest tragedy was losing the family I had planned. I never imagined that one day I would discover a family waiting for me that I thought was gone. I learned that life does not always return what it takes away in the way we expect. Sometimes it returns hope slowly, one conversation, one memory, and one moment at a time. Years after the day Lucas first walked into my hospital room, I still think about how a single moment can change the direction of an entire life. At the time, I believed I was simply meeting a young patient who needed a skilled surgeon. I never imagined that child would reconnect me with the family I thought I had lost forever. Life has a strange way of hiding its greatest surprises inside ordinary moments. Today, Lucas is no longer the quiet 9-year-old boy holding a blue stuffed elephant in a hospital bed. He is a confident teenager who loves science, baseball, and anything related to airplanes. Every time I watch him grow, I am reminded that the years we missed will always be part of our story, but they do not have to define the rest of it. I continue working at St. Andrew Medical Center, where I still perform heart surgeries and help families through some of their most difficult days. But my perspective has changed. Before Lucas came into my life again, I believed healing was something that happened only inside hospitals. I now understand that healing can happen at a kitchen table, during a quiet conversation, or in the simple act of showing up for someone who needs you. Emily and I never tried to recreate the past. We knew that the people we were 9 years ago no longer existed. Time had changed us. Loss had changed us. The years apart had changed us. Instead of chasing the life we once imagined, we chose to build a new one based on honesty and patience. Some people asked whether we would return to the relationship we had before everything happened. The truth was more complicated. Love is not a photograph that remains unchanged while time passes. Love is something that grows, adapts, and requires effort. We did not ignore the pain between us. We talked about it. We accepted that some wounds take time to heal. But every day we chose understanding over blame. Lucas became the reason we continued moving forward together. He deserved parents who could communicate, support each other, and create a safe place where he could grow. One evening, years after our reunion, I sat outside on the porch watching Lucas practice throwing a baseball in the yard. Emily sat beside me holding 2 cups of coffee. The scene looked ordinary, but I knew better than anyone how extraordinary it was. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of this happened?" Emily asked. I smiled quietly. "Sometimes. But then I remember that I would not have this moment." She looked toward Lucas and nodded. "Neither would I." We sat there without needing to say anything else. For so long, I had measured my life by what I lost. The future I planned. The family I thought disappeared. The years I believed were taken from me. But eventually, I learned that life cannot only be measured by what leaves. It must also be measured by what returns. The truth is, I did lose 9 years. I cannot pretend those years did not matter. I missed first steps, childhood memories, school, events, and countless ordinary moments that parents usually treasure. But I also gained something I never expected. I gained the chance to know my son. I gained the chance to forgive. I gained the chance to understand that even after deep disappointment, people can still choose compassion and a new beginning. When I look back now, I no longer see that painful chapter as the end of my story. I see it as the moment before everything changed. The child who came to me for surgery did not only need a doctor. He unknowingly gave me a second chance at fatherhood, family, and love. And after all those years, I finally understood that some connections are stronger than time, stronger than distance, and stronger than the silence that once separated us.